Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are listening from. This is a very special occasion. My name is Marco Ventura. I have the honor to start this panel on behalf of a working group of the G20 Interfaith Forum. Our working group is devoted to research and innovation for science, technology, and infrastructure. And we will devote our reflection today to artificial intelligence. The mandate of this working group is to monitor developments in research and innovation for science, technology, and infrastructure, with a particular focus on emerging digital technologies and artificial intelligence. The working group explores and reflects on the relevant normative, legal, and ethical implications, study and promote the role of religious or belief organizations and interreligious engagement. In addition, the working group endeavors to establish and encourage interdisciplinary dialogue amongst experts and actors, private and public, and establish a network of networks in these areas of endeavor. Now, this is an event like many others on the way to the G20 Interfaith, which will take place in Bologna, Italy, under the chairmanship this year of Italy in the G20. And we are particularly proud to host an event focusing on such a topical issue. And we are very grateful to all those who've been collaborating with our group, and in particular Branka and Robert, who will be speaking in the session as well. We are incredibly grateful to our speakers this afternoon, and I will let Branka introduce them. And we're also very, very grateful to the staff who's been helping us with the event. Now, please be aware that the event is recorded. And a final word of thanks for all the people who have registered and who are taking part with us in the event. Thank you very much, everyone. Time to start. The floor goes to Branka.
Thank you so much, Marco. My name is Branka Marian, and I'm a senior researcher at Project Plowshares. And today we have a great panel with us. And I just want to let you know, actually, that you can also join us in a more interactive discussion by going to menti.com, and you'll see the code there that you enter, and you can sort of answer some questions as we're speaking that sort of reflect back on what the speakers are saying. So just so you know that that information is available in the chat. The code number is 1247429, but that's probably difficult to follow. So you just check the chat and you'll see some of the questions there, and my colleagues at Plowshares will be sort of monitoring that, and so thanks to them. So without further ado, I'm really excited to have with us today Dr. Peter Acero, an associate professor in the School of Media Studies at the New School in New York City, Dr. Kanta Dihag, senior research fellow at Leverhulme Center for Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, John Markoff, a journalist and research affiliate of the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford. Dr. Neil Urbach, I think, is joining us at some point. He's the K.L. Yates Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies at Carnegie Mellon University, and Dr. Selma Shabanovich, Associate Professor of Informatics and Cognitive Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. So thank you all so much for being here. I guess, we have this big, broad question for you. I know it's going to be a challenge, but we would just really appreciate sort of your input and your own thoughts in terms of what is the one development of, artificial intelligence technology that you are most excited about? And then what is the one challenge or concern that you have with whether it's the application of this technology or perhaps its design or development? So maybe Dr. Dihag, if we want to start with you, if you can just provide us some of your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. So very much of my research focuses on hopes and fears for artificial intelligence in particular. So I'll sketch a very brief background of that in order to explain my answer to this question. But in short, I'm most excited about the ways in which we have, over the past millennia, thought through so many of the issues surrounding AI and particularly artificial general intelligence in narratives, so that we can anticipate many of the risks. But what I'm most concerned about is the way in which one particular narrative misaligns with contemporary public perceptions of AI. So my research is on the way AI has been imagined and portrayed throughout history and how this influences current perceptions, development and deployment of the technologies. And so in 2019, my colleague Stephen Cave and I published a paper in which we discussed the fact that in the English-speaking world, the narratives around artificial intelligence tend to present extremes. So they're either wildly utopian or horrendously dystopian. And all of that comes from the starting point that AI is a tool. It's a piece of technology that is designed to help us achieve our goals, but it's supposed to be an intelligent tool with attributes that we normally associate with humans. The more intelligent it becomes, of course. So a tool that is autonomous, that can think, that has goals, perhaps eventually even a mind. And that idea makes it very different to ordinary tools, and that has huge implications. So on the one hand, those attributes are what promise to make AI the ultimate technology, potentially limitless, and promises to work out the solutions to all our problems. And that's where AI represents the apotheosis of the technological dream, the dream that we can use our tools and machines to create a paradise on Earth. So that's the source of the extravagant hopes. But at the same time, the idea of creating tools with minds of their own creates in our minds inherent instabilities. So you can have a tool with goals that could have goals that misalign with ours, or a smart machine could outsmart us, or a machine with autonomy could choose to disobey, and that is the source of the extravagant fears. Now, we surveyed the British public about these hopes and fears, and we'll be extending that work internationally very soon. But what we found was that actually some of the scenarios that have traditionally been presented as utopian, as dream, as goal scenarios, are actually perceived with some trepidation, and especially the narrative around what Stephen Cave and I call gratification. And that is the idea that AI might one day socially interact with us in a way that is as good as or even better than social interactions with other people. And we did that survey before the pandemic. I think people will feel even more strongly about preferring human interactions now. So it's actually one of the seemingly utopian scenarios that I'm most concerned about, because there's such a misalignment between the positive narrative and the negative public response. And that summarizes, I guess, my main concern around this technology is that there are many narratives from, say, one part of the world or one dominant group that misalign with the hopes, the fears, the perceptions of other parts of the world, cultures, and other groups.
Thank you, Pat. That's fascinating. I think you're right. We are maybe all appreciating human interaction so much more this year, perhaps, than ever prior. So I really appreciate that kind of nice description of the narrative and the ideas that are sort of, I think, in the background in a lot of the developments of the technologies. So Dr. Shabanowicz, maybe we can hear from you and your own sort of thoughts and challenges and concerns and opportunities.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting me here. I think Dr. DeHull actually provided a really great intro into what I think are my hopes and challenges. And so my work is in the domains of social robotics and human-robot interaction. And like many in academia, industry, and society more generally, I am intrigued and also to some degree excited about the possibility for robotic technologies to become more useful to people in their everyday lives. And we now have several decades of research on how robots can be designed to interact with people in various everyday contexts. Of course, all of this first starts in labs, but we've also seen successful use cases in museums, in schools, in homes, in hospitals, interacting with all kinds of different people. And I think one of the the kind of aims of this work that intrigues me is this, considering this possibility that robots could perhaps help us take better care of ourselves and of each other. And we've seen research here that suggests that robots might be able to help older adults stay in their homes longer, provide people with social presence, like we were just discussing, that could maybe improve their mood and well-being, help children learn in more socially engaging ways, and even nudge people to behave more pro-socially, to be more kind, more collaborative, more generous towards one another. But I think the promise of these kinds of technologies also has many challenges. So one thing I often bring up in my talks as a kind of foil to describe the vision of social robots or robots in the home is actually a depiction that was presented with an article written by Bill Gates about robots in every home in 2007. So I'm gonna just do a little thing and share my screen and show you a little picture, which is this one. I think you can see it, but I can't now press the bottom. So, and this just shows a little picture of how we might see, or how in 2007 maybe we saw what robots would be in our home. So you see different kinds of robots doing the laundry, or we have Roombas who clean. And there's also an older adult there who's being helped by a robot. And I think this is a very typical kind of depiction in the field. However, there's certain things aside from the technology, which include cameras and of course a home PC, that really strike me here. One is the lack of people. So who here brings in these robots, who maintains them, who puts them there? Another is also the way that the kind of person who's the object of the robot's care is presented. They're very inactive, very passive. They don't seem to be a rich person with complex realities. They are just kind of there for the function as an object of the function of the robot's cleaning. And so this kind of perspective is what concerns me. And it concerns me because I think it shows what some of the main challenges that I see to this notion of human-centered robotics, or robots that people can use in their everyday lives. I think there's a major concern about needing to have more diversity and inclusion in the design of these machines, as well as in considering how we might use them, how we evaluate them. We often discuss how robotics researchers are commonly from what psychologists have called weird contexts, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. But the designs of these machines implicate a much broader set of stakeholders who often have much less voice in the decision-making about not just what little features of the robot get made, but actually setting priorities for what we should fund, what we should consider, and also actually really describing what the social issues that we have are, and how they connect with technology. So we often see technology kind of addressing, for example, aging as a deficit rather than as part of everyday human experience. And so I think these visions of robots kind of obscure broader networks of people who labor to create the contexts that are amenable to robots, who are needed to operate and maintain them. And we need to kind of consider broader participation in this whole pursuit in order to think through what kind of values are built into these systems, what people are being nudged towards with them, how they are being kind of monitored and judged as part of these everyday implementations of robotic technology. And so what I would like to kind of call for, and what we try to do more and more of in our work, is to kind of figure out as one of the main priorities for robotics and for AI development more broadly, how to integrate a more complex understanding of social issues and realities into design, not just as kind of a motivation to start from, but really as a central component. And also consider how to create a more participatory framework for making decisions about how we invest in and develop these technologies. And so I think, therefore, you know, if we just focus on the technological development itself in the short term, which is always exciting, we won't necessarily produce the social benefits we desire, but we also might fail to provide the promised technological capabilities because they're predicated on certain kinds of social infrastructures and organizations that really go along with and need to be there to support a particular kind of use of technology. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Yeah, so you know, that's so fascinating. I think we all sort of see afterwards, after the technology is developed, how, you know, a certain concern arises, and, you know, everyone's so surprised, and then, you know, you see years of people raising concerns about the development of that particular technology, and we only seem to really kind of face the crisis moment, right, when we see something being misapplied or misused, and we don't really think about, I think, some of those sort of longer term transformations that are happening sometimes, and sort of stepping back is a nice sort of thing to do to kind of understand how these things are shaping society. So thank you so much for that. It's so fascinating. I don't, you know, that whole robot in the house scenario really may be scary for some more than helpful. I don't mind the Roomba, but maybe the surveillance technology we could talk about. So John, maybe we could get your thoughts on, you know, as you've been listening, and your own sort of perspectives on these issues.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's really remarkable to me that it's been how many years since the Roomba was put into the homes, and it's still the only robot in the home, but that's another subject. So several decades ago, I noticed that the framing of our current debate over the role of artificial intelligence first took place when two computer science laboratories located on either side of the Stanford campus set out with opposing philosophical goals. At the dawn of the interactive computer era in 1962, John McCarthy founded the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory with the goal of building a thinking machine. At that time, he told his DARPA funders the project would take a decade. That same year, on the other side of campus, Douglas Engelbart, who is known as the inventor of the mouse and the co-inventor of hypertext, created the Augmentation Research Center and coined the term augmented intelligence, or IA. His work led directly to the modern personal computer. Steve Jobs would describe the IA approach best when he referred to the personal computer as a bicycle for the mind. But what's important, however, is this conundrum or dichotomy was laid out at the very beginning of the modern computing era. One laboratory wanted to replace the human mind, and the other wanted to extend it. And that, of course, is at the heart of the deep concerns about the coming impact of this technology today. 6 decades later, what is most hopeful to me about where the field of AI is headed is that Engelbart's philosophy has become the dominant one in the field. At Stanford today, I participate in an organization called the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. This is a very different state of affairs than 15 years ago, when I would make an annual trek to campus to give a lecture on the ethics of computer hacking in a computer security class. At that time, it was pretty much the only discussion of ethical issues underlying the technology on campus. In contrast, today, you can't turn around here without tripping over an ethics class, seminar, or discussion. And I see that as a hopeful sign. For these machines and programs are designed by humans who embed their values in the systems they create. What worries me is the potential for the casual misuse of increasingly powerful AI tools, particularly the recently designed language models such as GPT-3. The recently proposed EU AI regulations would make it illegal for a conversational AI to pose as a human. I'm not sure that is a strong enough prohibition about the systems we are building, however. Some years ago, Microsoft tried 2 different experiments on 2 different continents. In China, Microsoft researchers scraped the web and created a conversational AI directly, which could have been taken directly from the movie Her, intended to create prolonged interactions with a mostly young group of millions of users. That time, 20% of the users typed "I love you" to Zhao Ice. Sometime later, they ran a similar experiment in the United States with a chatbot known as Tay, and generated a homophobic, misogynistic, racist monster. I think the 2 experiments speak volumes about cultural differences. I'm concerned about many aspects of the potential future misuse of language models in particular. Not only are there challenges posed by deception and the specter of lives that are increasingly mediated by machines, one of the largest employment categories that has grown most dramatically globally since World War II are relatively low-skilled white-collar jobs that involve communication via telephone. Sales and support are largely the way companies have stayed in contact with customers. As language models and natural language processing systems are perfected, these jobs are increasingly at risk, which of course brings us back to the original AI versus IA dichotomy. It is in part a question of design, but I'm afraid it is also one of the market values that are inherent in capitalist economies. To come completely full circle, I want to note several science fiction writers and a Silicon Valley technologist who describe modern corporations as simply being slow AIs. Because algorithms are increasingly a force in the modern world, it is something I worry about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I think you said a lot there, and about, you know, even some of the advances in technology. I know when I used this transcription software once, and I shared the story so often because it was really interesting, but I was in Northern Ireland, and I don't know if you've ever heard someone with a Belfast accent. It's challenging, and it's very challenging for computer systems. And it kept turning, you know, the IRA into Al Qaeda, and then my transcript was quite something. You know, it did absolutely made no sense, and was quite problematic in a few spots. But that was, you know, some 10 years ago. So I was interested in see how it had improved, and of course the technology had greatly improved. I haven't tested it on someone with a Belfast accent yet, though, so I don't know if they quite captured that context. But I think there are so many issues you've identified for us. I really hope we can get back to some of this in the questions and sort of unpack that a little bit. Thank you so much, John. So now I don't see Eli here, so maybe I'll just go to Peter. Peter, if you could provide us with some of this, your own thoughts and some of the things you've heard on, maybe some reflections as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's tough to follow three smart panelists who've said so many interesting things already. But I think what really got me interested in artificial intelligence to begin with was the sense in which it's a sort of a technological mirror for how we think about ourselves in many respects. As a philosopher, to sort of write down a computer program that you think represents intelligence or emotion or social interaction or addresses certain problems in the real world is at one hand like a theory of a philosophical exercise, but it's also a practical tool that does something in the world. It's a computer program or a robot that actually acts and has all these consequences we maybe didn't anticipate. So it's a nice kind of experiment and things like that. But also as a philosopher, we never agree with any of these philosophies. So there's always room for criticism and as a tool to really ask, whose values are embedded here? Where did those values come from? Who is served by them? And what are these sort of unintended consequences? And I think within that, there's sort of two big categories in which AI is concerning or scary, if you will. And then there's a whole range of different applications that kind of fit into those categories. But I think the two categories are first, what we might call artificial stupidity or stupid AI, right? And these are artificial intelligence programs that do something, they work in some sense, but they're sort of very blind to the realities of the world as we understand it as human beings and how we live it and what we want to achieve. We can call that a mismatch of values and goals, or just poor design, or unexpected or unintended consequences of implementing different systems. But I think we're seeing a lot of that as we, send these different systems out into the world, and they do things that we don't really expect. And then on the other side of it are the ones that are sort of really, really good at stuff, right? They're highly effective, but what they ultimately are is an automation. And automation comes out of, a history of industrial capitalism, and it's about amplifying the productivity of certain interests and functions and values. And at a social level, on a global scale, that's going to increase all sorts of different forms of inequality, right? So the institutions and the individuals who have the power to shape and build these systems will have their interests advanced. they'll make more money, they'll get more power, they'll allocate and control more resources over time. And those who don't have access to these technologies, or for whom these technologies are working against, will wind up with less and less of that. And so whether we're talking about technological unemployment on a kind of grand scale, or specific kinds of applications, and I think Markov already mentioned the ability of these systems to imitate human voices. And we've seen all kinds of social manipulation, disinformation campaigns happening through social media already, using things like sock puppets, but also just humans. But of course, we can automate all of that and automate the deception of people at mass scale. But we also have face recognition and other kinds of biometric technologies that are able to recognize people and thus connect different information sources across different sensors and platforms and databases, and effectively track and trace us all of the time, collect enormous amounts of data and private data, and essentially survey us all of the time. And even without having robots and cameras and microphones in our apartments and houses, which we also are now adding, because we want a voice assistant here, or we want a smart doorbell there. And so those sorts of things really sort of transforming how we think about privacy, how we think about public discourse, how we think about surveillance, and then issues I work on a lot of autonomous weapon systems, and the ability of machines to actually make life and death decisions over humans, and the implications of that for warfare and policing and even self-defense and things like that are profound. And then there's whole other sets of applications, because these systems, of course, are being used to determine whether you're going to get a loan, whether you're going to get a job, whether you're going to get into school. And I think the other panelists have already talked about the way in which we need to have these larger discussions about the policies that should govern these at a societal level. And then how do we actually implement that if we are going to adopt an algorithm or a computer program that's going to make these decisions? How do we best do that? And to always keep in mind that these are tools, right? These are the extensions of us, even if we try to model ourselves in them in certain respects. And ultimately, we have to ensure that there's accountability and transparency in how these systems function, that there's mechanisms for people, human beings, to appeal the decisions that are made by these automated systems, particularly when they're governing important aspects of human rights, human dignity, access to healthcare and education and jobs and things like that. And that we don't make the mistake of thinking that these systems are really smart and really capable and really understand things that they don't actually understand. They're really good at statistics, and they do a lot of statistics, and that's helpful for certain problems, but it's not really understanding, and they don't recognize us as human beings. They're not moral agents, they're not legal agents, and things like that.
Thanks a lot, Peter. There's a lot there. And I know you and I often talk about some of the scarier parts. So I was kind of hoping to keep it light this morning, but I think it's really important to highlight some of these challenges, and particularly in, what are sometimes described as safety critical contexts, right? Or high risk applications. So I'm really glad you brought some of those out too, because sometimes, we kind of, I think we all just don't want to talk, think about some of these really, really dark and difficult choices that might be made. We wanted to get to the input from Menti, but if I could just, because everyone's still putting in some answers there, if I could just ask each of you, just some quick thoughts on whether you sort of like what we all said. We want more conversation, and we want more, sort of more of a discussion from the design level on about some of these systems. But is there sort of one particular piece of advice or one particular regulation or something, or several likely, that you would kind of think is necessary, or you're thinking about and saying, look, why isn't this happening? Or is there just a dialogue that's needed at this point, or are we sort of in need of more concrete sort of actions and more concrete policies? I know, John, you mentioned the the EU proposed regulation. Of course, that's at the moment still proposed. And each state will likely determine its own sort of understanding of it. But maybe we'll start with John. Do you see this kind of regulation that's been proposed in the EU as something that's effective, or should we have more of that, or are there other options? I know this is a really difficult question, and I thank you for allowing me the liberty, because I'm thinking of this myself. So I'm like, I have these great experts, let me ask them.
So I think the EU process, which I guess is a multi-year process, is absolutely essential. And I'm also a little concerned because of the way that the implementation of the privacy regulations have played out, and how the largest corporations have been very facile in learning how to essentially, would argue, work around the regulations. So I have concerns about the process. I have to confess, I haven't read the regulations yet. I've read the press accounts of the regulations, and the issues that they've brought up, or they've posed, I think are profound and important. And I'm hopeful that the EU process will have a global impact, will force, because we're so interconnected. But if you look at what's happening with these surveillance systems in China today, I don't understand how the EU process can affect the deployment of these technologies in China. The deception, the one I raised, the prohibition against deception, I think is perhaps one of the most important in terms of our relationships with these machines going forward. I've come to describe the Turing test as a test of human gullibility. We have this propensity, this absolute propensity to want to anthropomorphize anything we interact with, whether it's dogs or cars or these new AIs that we're creating. And I worry a lot about that. I mean, I read enough science fiction, and I see the way these things have been adopted, going all the way back to ELIZA. Now we have very, very powerful ELIZAs, and particularly, once again, language models are going to have the impact of changing the way these systems interact with us.
Thank you so much, John. Kanta, maybe do you have thoughts on this? I know you talked about this survey that you've done and the sort of dialogue. We have had something similar in Canada, this sort of dialogue as well on AI. And so just wondering about your own thoughts on this.
Yeah, so what we saw in our survey was really, well, two things. One is about what people hope for and are afraid of, and how that misaligns with the kind of dominant narrative. So that really shows that those narratives represent the perspectives of a minority, but it's unfortunate that this is a powerful minority. But on the other hand, they also expressed a sense of helplessness, of a feeling, oh, this is all in the hands of these $9 billion companies that all build AI, and what is a little individual going to do. And I think the idea of legislating against it, but also of public dialogue around it, might be a first step into giving people a sense of ownership or of control, or at least of understanding what is going on. But then, precisely because these processes are held not in the hands of a democratic government, but in the hands of corporations, that might be extremely difficult to achieve.
Thank you so much, Kanta. Maybe Salma, if you have thoughts.
Sure. So, I deal a lot with healthcare technologies. And so, one thing that seems apparent there in terms of regulation is with these new kind of technologies, there's always the concern of how do we kind of fit this in somewhere into the existing structures, and the structures themselves kind of follow after the development. So I think that's always part of the concern. And then another thing that I always wonder about is the kind of twin meaning of autonomy and how we think about that. So one is the machine autonomy, which we kind of envision as something like they're doing it by themselves, which we know is not the case. And And then the other is human autonomy. So when we're interacting with these kinds of technologies, like what additional constraints do they bring into our ability to act? And I think relating to this kind of concern with deception, you know, how much are we aware of that? And I think, you know, even in terms of thinking about deception, you know, in human robot interaction studies, we often know people know that these things are robots, but when they interact with them, they, you know, it's very common for, you know, even me, like I know it's a robot or any other kind of roboticist and anyone really using them to kind of forget that in the moment. And, you know, act within the narrative of, you know, it's an agent, it, you know, has something that is doing, it's social in some way. And so how do we, I don't know that that's necessarily something that can be fixed with legislation, but I think it's something that we need to consider as we design these and as we have these discussions, which is also why I would like to hear more voices and more different perspectives and more different kinds of values being, you know, being brought up in these kinds of discussions, because, you know, we have people who are affected who are direct maybe users and directly in contact with the technology, but there are also many indirect effects that come to folks who, you know, might be replaced. But even if we talk about augmentation, how is their work being augmented, or how is their experience being augmented? I think is a question that needs to be addressed.
That's an excellent point. I don't know if anyone's seen the video of I think it's the Atlas robot being hit by with a hockey stick, and, you know, or pushed around, and you just feel so bad. You're like, why are you hurt? You know, and then you have this sort of disassociation thinking about it's just a robot and they're trading it. But just that initial reaction, I think that you're highlighting, is that people really feel bad. And I know there've been studies done when you're asked to hurt a robot, and, you know, people really don't want to do that. They don't want to hurt a robot. So yeah, I agree. That's really, I think, maybe something to think about more. Peter, I know I've been leaving you last. I hope you know, apologies,
least,
but
right?
just, yes, not least, certainly.
Yeah, so this semester I'm teaching a seminar on big tech and society. So it's hard not to think about that when you ask a regulation question. But I think it's important to note that, you know, these big companies, these big tech companies that are sort of controlling, in some sense, AI right now, or leading it, or have sort of led us out of the most recent AI winter, are really doing this because of their control of data, right? So they're big companies. They're companies that collect lots of data. They have lots of data processing centers and things like that. And what has sort of led to this latest revolution and interest in artificial intelligence are these kind of deep learning algorithms, these kind of massive statistical analysis techniques that require lots and lots of data about us in order to generate, you know, functional technologies. And, you know, beyond that, of course, there's a lot of innovation in AI that's happened over many decades, and we don't often think of as AI. We just think of it as a useful tool or application or algorithm at this point. But in the 1960s, that was considered an AI problem. But what that, I think, points to is this consolidation of power, this consolidation of wealth, this consolidation of data, and the ability to use that data, which, under the sort of, you know, the way that the United States legal system works, and Silicon Valley being the sort of epicenter of much of this development, and being in the United States and under that, has allowed them to keep kind of private control over the data that they're collecting, the algorithms that they're using. And it's, you know, transformed our society in ways that we are still trying to fathom and comprehend in many respects. But I think it represents a transformation in the kind of political economy that isn't unlike, you know, the transition from feudalism to more, you know, democratic forms of government at some point, that we really have to think about a kind of a new social contract if we're going to have these kinds of institutions that have that much power, that much control, collect all of that data about us, that there need to be democratic mechanisms for us to actually have input on how those rules get made, what kind of data gets collected, what are acceptable and unacceptable uses of it. And there's just, you know, a whole array of issues that arise from this, particularly for democratic societies, but really for all societies, and thinking about how these systems are being developed and who's developing them, and then what interests are they ultimately serving, are, I think, going to be crucial going forward. And just the sort of old versions of antitrust law that kind of broke up oil companies or telephone companies in the past aren't really, you know, sufficient to explain the kind of phenomenon that we have with these kind of current internet companies and the ability of these technologies to shape our beliefs about the world, nudge us into different kinds of behaviors and activities, as well as the kind of massive redistribution of wealth that they are capable of, that we've already witnessed.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot there, Peter. I think so many challenges, and thinking about how we respond, how we respond, and if we indeed, you know, are able to respond in sort of in a timely manner to some of these challenges. Because I remember, you know, 2006, getting a Facebook account and thinking, oh, this is just going to be another website. You know, how wrong I was at that time, of course. So you know, we've asked. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the results here. Of some of you who went to Menti. We really appreciate it. You can see what sort of people have said as you've been talking about what excites them about artificial intelligence. And, you know, I think there you see just the potential and just, you know, thinking about problem solving and the ability, I think, to sort of overcome certain inequities that this, you know, technology perhaps has the potential to, you know, make society a much better place. And then we go to what concerns you about artificial intelligence, and we see privacy, you know, really being one of the, I think, bigger ones here. But also in terms of alienation, I think Kant really talked about this, as well as accountability, possible weaponization of technologies, rapid growth. I don't know if anything really strikes you here as being surprising. I think we all kind of hear about some of these challenges in the broader discussion. But I think what's really interesting to me is this sort of split of, you know, our world governments paying attention to the ethics of AI deployment, and most I think people, there's, you know, there's a split. People are unsure. But there's a lot of disagreement, I think, with that, and I think that's really something to think about in response to, you know, are we developing the kinds of regulations that we want? And in terms of, you know, governance and regulation, I think you also touched upon, and I'm sorry I'm going through these quickly because I want you to ask questions. Please go in the chat and pose your questions, and I will ask them. So I want to leave some time for questions there, but, you know, really interesting that it is, you know, the perception sometimes that maybe governments aren't capable of responding, but there is this, maybe this is interesting from concept too, maybe you found this, that people do want the government to step in and respond, and that largely people, I think, find industry standards and sort of own regulation as being insufficient. And then, you know, we, I think, all recognize that we need some combination, right, of regulation and industry standards and indeed design. And I'm really sorry that Ila couldn't join us because you know, he's been really excellent at highlighting the role of design and the way, you know, the way you start from the design stage and think about the implications of the technologies you're creating as being really an important part of this discussion as well. And then we asked, because this is the Interfaith 20 and we're going to be submitting these recommendations to the G20 in Bologna, we also wanted to sort of look at religion and faith and how faith, you know, informs AI, and really thinking about how religions can kind of work together and think about maybe sharing some basic values or moral standards. So it's really great. Thank you for providing us with this input, because we wanted to sort of approach it from, you know, quite diverse and interfaith kind of understanding of some of these technologies. So yeah, peace is important to all religions, and some of these, I think, are going to be quite useful to us. and how can AI contribute positively to the future of religion? So there's a lot of interesting things there. Maybe I'll get to the questions, and we'll look through some of this, and maybe I'll pose some of you one of these questions as well. So I will stop my sharing, and you can see if you have any specific questions to ask, or you please just put them in the chat and let us know, and I will ask them. But I was really, Peter, struck by the sort of idea of how, how in fact laws, maybe in California, we often think about global regulations, but sometimes, laws made in California can have a much more deeper impact on the applications of certain technologies than laws made by certain states, right? I mean, this is something that we often hear. So it's really interesting. Okay, so Robert, you want to ask, how do our speakers feel about the provocative statement that AI is a religion in itself? Is AI a religion in itself? This is quite challenging, Robert. And John, maybe, and Peter.
I just to broaden that slightly. When I was working on a book a number of years ago, I was struck in terms of speaking with a number of the people who designed what I would call the second generation of AI. How many of them had decided to go into the field after seeing the movie 2001: Space Odyssey? A number, I could actually cite names, a number of people saw HAL and they wanted to build HAL, which was not the reaction I had. But to Kanta's point about narrative, I know both of the original architects of Siri well, and both Tom Gruber and Adam Chyer decided to build Siri based on their desire to create what we know as Knowledge Navigator, which was actually a vision video that was put together by Apple Computer in 1987. And so narrative, or sort of worldview, is super important in the way we design these machines. And I don't know whether to be optimistic about that or be terrified, but my earlier point about Roomba, I think it's been almost 20 years now since Roomba was first introduced, and that's still the only robot we have in the home. I think the narrative sometimes takes over, and we mistake our assumptions about the machine for the actual state of the machine. Someone's case about assistive machines in the home, that's the question I ask roboticists now. I don't ask about when will we have self-driving cars. I ask, when will we have a robot that can safely give an aging human a shower? And no roboticist can give me a meaningful answer to that. And yet I think it's the most important advance that could possibly be made in the robotics world.
Interesting. Peter, you had something, maybe sound like do you have a thought for us?
Sure, I'll jump in and just start by agreeing at Stanley Kubrick's 2001 huge impact. It was the HAL computer was actually in the novel and the movie created at the University of Illinois in 1995, where I was in grad school. So of course the English department and computer science department had to have a big birthday party, brought in all these wonderful intellectuals to talk about that. And David Stork has a book about this with all of the artifacts that he's collected from HAL as well. That has actually influenced AI and myself, but I also tend more towards the philosophy side than the building side these days, but I've done some of the building myself. But I think, yeah, in terms of thinking about how do we, well, I just lost my train of thought thinking about how, wait, what was I, what was the question again?
Is AI a religion?
Oh, is it a religion? Oh, right, yes. So, yeah, actually, so I did a review of Hans Moravec's book quite a while back, where I called it Techno-Prophecy. And I think there's a lot of sort of prophetic thinking that goes into thinking about futures in which these AI technologies and robotic technologies function. And I think that's driven more by the desire to build the technology or to promote a specific version of the technology or a vision of that the creators of it have, because they want, that house that Selma showed us that has all these robots in the different rooms serving these different functions. ostensibly, to take care of our elderly citizens. But, what is that level of care? Where are the other humans that we're trying to enable this human to be able to engage with and interact with, if we're sort of replacing them all with machines, and further kind of creating this social isolation? And so there's a sort of disconnect in these narratives and stories and sort of systems of prophecy, if you will, of what actually is required for human life, and where does that actually subsist in our environment, because we're replacing it with this desire to have a technology that we have a sort of interest in as designers or builders or investors in sort of promoting for the society, and we have to kind of ignore all of the things that it's displacing and replacing in real people's lived experience.
Thank you so much. Someone, do you have something, Kanta? Kanta, you have?
Yes, I think it's a great, a very interesting, provocative statement, AI as a religion. And I am inclined to agree on several counts. And so some of this is really influenced by, well, Professor Geraci himself and his book, Apocalyptic AI. So there are 3 points that I think are the most important sort of points of that AI and religion have in common. And the first is regarding human exceptionalism. So there are many religions that describe a way in which humanity is different from all the other animals, and it is often related to tool use. So there is the narrative of Prometheus giving either fire and tool use to humans, or there are some versions where Prometheus creates the humans. There are versions where humans were last in line and so didn't have any claws or fur, and so were given tools to in order to survive in the world, so that tools were humanity's weapon. There are stories of Adam and Eve having to tend the Garden of Eden, but also having to live by the sweat of their brows when they're outside it. So that is tool use as human exceptionalism, and of course then creating the ultimate tool means achieving the pinnacle of what a human is for, in a sense. Then there is of course creationism, the idea that by creating an intelligence of our own, by creating something that is human-like, humanity becomes like the gods, who up till now essentially were those who could create intelligent life. And then there is singularitarianism, which various people have described as a form of religion, which is that the idea of the singularity becomes so important a future prospect that it really shapes one's morality, one's plans for the future, in very much the same way that a religion shapes one's life, one's morality, and one's future, as any more ordinary religion would. And whether that leads to a future vision of an AI potentially enslaving us, and so an apocalypse happening, and so we must all prepare for that, or that we might all merge with the AI and so become immortal, transcended beings ourselves. Again, there are so many parallels from all kinds of world religions here, that I think that indeed, in some ways, AI, even if it might be a religion in itself, or very much reflects religions that are already there.
Thank you so much, Kanta. So do you have something on this, or maybe even when will we see this robot that can, be in care homes or at home?
So I'll try to answer both very quickly. So one thing that I was trying to think, as everyone was talking about what would be productive for me in terms of thinking about AI and religion together. And so one thing I think that maybe combines them is the promise and desire to use our skills and capabilities to improve our lot as a kind of community. And so, because I think, you know, one of the things that that engineers and designers of these technologies do is, you know, there is a lot of desire. Of course, there's a lot of focus on technology, but there's also, I think, sincere desire to improve the state of the world. And of course, depending on our background and our training, you know, we tend to approach that in different ways with the tools that we have, the frameworks that we have, you know, the things that we know how to do. And so I think thinking through, you know, maybe religion and AI, one of the things is that, you know, we can understand that having kind of very set simplistic rules that we try to follow to the word is not going to work. You know, our situation is dynamic. The tools that we have, the things we're developing, society is dynamic. So we have to figure out how to kind of respond to this dynamic situation much better. And I also think that, you know, it's obvious that these things need to be done through social engagement rather than kind of division and exclusion. And to me, that's the big question, is how do we actually do this? How do we create possibilities for, you know, more of this interdisciplinary and intercultural, intersocietal discussion to happen? And I think part of the something maybe we can learn from religion is, you know, these things could be long-term aims. They're not things that are going to happen tomorrow or in 2 years or in 10 years or 20 years, whatever, you know, people like to pose as kind of shorter term goals. And so I don't know that we will ever have the robot that is going to by itself give somebody a shower. I know they have robots that can wash your hair these days. But I think part of the question, part of the reason why is because giving somebody a shower isn't just the physical act of cleaning them with some soap and water. There's a very, you know, affective and interpersonal and kind of meaningful component to that we may never be able to, but also probably don't want to just relegate to machines. And so I think for me, the question is always, how do we put the people and the machines together to provide the things that we need, not so much how can we get them to do it by themselves. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is such a great discussion. I know I could talk to you all, you know, for hours and hours about this, and but I think we'll have to leave it here. I just want to give Robert a chance to maybe provide some thoughts. There's so many great questions. I want to just keep asking them, but I know we need to, you know, be mindful of everyone's time. Robert?
Sure. First, I want to say a final thank you to our fantastic group of panelists. I could not be more grateful for your time, your energy, and your expertise. And also to everyone here, our online audience that came to learn and participate with us, thank you so much for being here. And as a quick final thank you to my partners in crime, Marco Ventura, Branka Marajan, and James Christie, not to mention the entire G20 Interfaith Organization and the amazing help that's been provided by the folks at Plowshares to help make this all work today. I really couldn't be more grateful. Robotics and AI technologies, you know, we're all clearly seeing challenge many of the assumptions about how we can and will lead our lives. We've had a brief opportunity today to see how these technologies raise important concerns in the economy, in education, in global politics. But we're also seeing opportunities, perhaps a chance to deconstruct some long-standing expectations about our social structures and our opportunities as we see them. So naturally, our narratives skew to opposite ends of these benefits and challenges, a polarization that splits researchers and the public, differing cultural groups, and more. It's important for us to find the right path forward in situating robots and AI into our everyday lives, helping us to care for ourselves and for one another. But to do that, we must build machines inclusively and with attention to the human beings who are at the very context of human-robot interaction. The very goals of AI, thinking machine or augmented intelligence, remain central to how we think about AI and the ethics of coming technologies. How do we effectively go beyond the casual integration of these technologies and make our work more intentional in design, regulation, and deployment to build honest technologies that support people economically and socially? The design difference between AI and IA, intelligence augmentation, can be crucial to making this work. Of course, given our different value systems and philosophical perspectives, this is difficult work, especially given the capacity of powerful interests to direct decision-making and capitalize, in all meanings of that word, on our decisions and our understanding of them and of the technologies. In keeping with the UN goals of sustainable development and the G20 goal of digitalization for all, we hope to take what we've learned here today, continue our process of consulting with experts in various fields, and provide inclusive, focused policy advice to benefit the global community. The 1st to 2nd century Rabbi Tarfon is well known for having said, "It is not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either." So let us all contribute as we can. We thank you for being here with us today and helping us move forward that project. Oh, you know what we should do also real quick? Although there's only a few of us with a mic, I was going to say we should clap for our speakers, but there's the clapping won't really work very well. But
There's a
thank you all
gesture,
again.
Yeah, there's a human, yes, there's the human translated icons. Well, thank you so much. Yeah,
so much everyone for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Keep working with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Contribution is much needed, and the group is very open, so please.
Yeah, I think others have said this, but this was one of the most fascinating AI discussions, and we truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.